In this session, we are playing a 2-5 game. It is running at 101 Poker in Houston. We have a button straddle to $10. The small blind folds. The big blind, who is a slightly looser reg, makes the call. Another reg under the gun makes the call, and it gets to me in middle position. I look down at 8 of clubs, 7 of clubs, and I raise it to 55. I think that this hand is typically going to be a raise here. As I get to earlier positions, though, I'm going to start mixing more and folding probably under the gun. I don't expect in most live environments that I'm going to be 3-bet extremely aggressive, and I'm often going to go multi-way, so I think this hand plays a little bit better in that aspect. It folds to the reg in the big blind. He makes the call, and the under the gun player makes the call. We go to the flop with a pot of $177. The flop is the king of diamonds, 3 of diamonds, queen of spades. It checks to me. For the most part, I'm going to be betting a lower frequency multi-way. I do think that I have a range advantage on this board, but when I am choosing hands to bluff with, I primarily want to be using hands that have relatively decent equity, at least a backdoor to the nuts, and the 8 of clubs, 7 of clubs doesn't really have anything going on for it. As far as sizing on this board, I think you can go anywhere from 33 to 60% pot. I'm going to be using slightly smaller sizes multi-way. Regardless, my hand seems like a pure check, so I do check. The turn is the 3 of clubs. It checks around to me again. And I think at this point, I still have a pretty considerable range advantage. I would expect my opponents to be betting a chunk of their king X and almost all of their 3X at this point. I can still have hands like ace 3, pocket kings, pocket queens, ace king, king queen that are all very nutted hands on this board. So I think when it checks to me, it's reasonable to fire here with very low equity just because my opponents are unlikely to have a very strong continuing range. I think if I do bet here, I want to be representing that nut advantage and use larger sizes. So I do bet 125 into 177. The reg in the big blind calls. The under the gun player folds. I think when the reg continues here, I think he's going to have mostly queen X and some king X. Again, he can't have any of that strong king X for the most part. I think his range is relatively condensed overall. The river is the 2 of spades. It checks to me, and I think I still have that nut advantage. The 2 doesn't change anything. I think if I do want to bluff at this pot, I want to be using very large sizes in general and represent those top pair combos, 2 pair combos, and trips. So I go with a overbet, betting 600 into 427, trying to maximize the amount of pressure that I am putting on my opponent's king and queen X combos, and he tank folds. So we scoop a relatively good sized pot early on in the session. In this hand, we see a limp from the reg in the low jack. The hijack reg limps behind, and the cutoff, who is a relatively good, slightly tighter middle-aged player, opens to 20. I look down at king of spades, 10 of hearts on the button. I don't really want to be calling this hand, even in position, going multi-way. I would much prefer to be folding or 3-betting this hand. I think it is a low-frequency 3-bet. And I think when cutoff opens to such a small sizing after multiple limpers, he's more likely to have a slightly weaker holding. I raise to 65. The small blind, who's sitting with about $130 in front of him, he looks down and he goes all in for 130. It folds to the cutoff, and he asks if the betting is open, meaning can I raise if he just calls. I am able to raise, so after he contemplates for a little while, he ends up folding. Obviously, king of spades, 10 of hearts is not a great hand against a strong 4-bet shove range, but with the price that we're getting to only put $65 more in, it's a pretty mandatory call. I do make the call. The board runs out 3, 4, 3, 5, and we hit the king on the river, and that rivered king gives us the best hand. We show the king 10, and our opponent mucks. In this hand, I open up the ace of spades, 10 of clubs from early position. I get a call from a middle-aged player in the low jack, a call from the cutoff, from the button, and the small blind. We go to a flop with a pot of $105. The flop is the ace of hearts, 9 of spades, 4 of clubs. It checks to me. I think this is a spot where if I do continue with a value bet, I'm mostly going to be using my stronger ace-x, my ace-king, ace-queen, ace-jack, and I think most of my weaker ace-x is primarily going to be checking. I think ace-10 kind of falls in that threshold area where I'm definitely going to be mixing either a small bet or a check. Never going to be really using large sizes on this relatively draw ace-high board multi-way. I do decide to bet. I bet $35 into 105, and I get raised by the low jack to 90. It folds around to me, and I think here typically this is a pretty standard call, but I think it's very difficult for my opponent to have a bluff here as well. There's just really not very many straight draws or flush draws. I don't really expect him to have something like 5-3 suited, 3-2 suited. I think he's primarily going to have sets, 2 pair, and stronger ace-x here. I think for the price that we are getting, I do want to probably call at some frequency. I do make the call. The turn is the 4 of diamonds. I check to him, and he makes a bet of 150 into 285. I think at this point, his value combos have been diminished somewhat. A set of 4s and ace-4 is less likely now, especially with me holding the ace of spades. But I also think that this opponent is capable of having stronger ace-x that I'm losing to here. And I think when he barrels on a turn card that doesn't bring any draws in, he's representing a pretty strong hand, and there's really no natural bluffs here. So even though I made the call on the flop and nothing is really changed for the most part, I tend to believe players here, especially in live settings. I do make the fold, and he shows us ace-king that he flatted pre-flop. In this hand, we have a under the gun limp for $5. It folds to the middle position, who overlimps, and the reg in the hijack overlimps as well. It gets to me in the small blind, and I have a pretty clear open. I open to $40 with ace of diamonds, jack of spades. The initial 2 limpers fold, and the reg calls 40. We go to a flop with a pot of $95. The flop is the 2 of spades, 3 of clubs, 2 of hearts. Generally going to be using smaller sizes and a lot more check raises on these dry paired boards where it is very hard for either of our ranges to interact. I think I have a pretty massive range advantage on this board and a massive nut advantage as well, so I definitely can use large sizes here if I would like. My specific hand is going to be playing primarily as a check. I have relatively good showdown value, and I don't necessarily want to be bloating the pot. I do check, and the reg checks behind. The turn is the 8 of diamonds. I don't think the 8 of diamonds changes too much on this board. The hands that are beating us now are ace-8, 9-8, and 8-7 for the most part. I think a lot of my opponents' pocket 4s through pocket 7s and 3x would have been betting the flop at a high frequency. Players very much overvalue having denial on these type of boards and not wanting to see any overcards that can beat their pair. I do check here, and my opponent bets 25. Relatively small sizing. I think I have a pretty clear call here. The ace-jack is ahead of all of his bluffs, and I still have 6 outs to improve to the best hand. I do make the call. We go to the river with a pot of 145. The river is the 2 of diamonds, which does not really change anything. I check to him, he tanks for a little bit and he ends up checking back. He shows us ace 9 off and we show the ace jack and we scoop a small one. In this hand we have a older, tighter gentleman who opens up to 20 in middle position. The reg that we've been battling with a couple times, 3 bets from the low jack to 80. It gets to me in the cutoff. I look down at ace of spades, king of hearts. I do think that this reg is capable of 3-betting a relatively wide range, a little bit less so versus the older gentleman with his image and stack size, but I do think that ace king is going to be a relatively pure 4-bet here. I usually don't have a cold calling range to an open and a 3-bet here. If I did have a cold calling range, I would much prefer to have something like ace king suited that plays slightly better multi-way and can float a little bit more on flops and turns. I do decide to 4-bet to 185. It folds around to the older gentleman in middle position and he jams all in for 145 total. The low jack thinks for a little bit and he makes the call. We go to a flop with a pot of $522. The flop is the 8 of hearts, 3 of clubs, 2 of clubs. It checks to me. In this spot, I'm almost exclusively going to be using a 25% pot size, and depending on the board texture, I'm going to be pure betting or pure checking my entire range. On this particular board texture, it's relatively dry, so I will usually be continuing here. Even multi-way, if the low jack folds, I think I am ahead of a good portion of middle position's range, and I also have 6 clean outs usually to make the best hand. If this board was a little bit more connected, like 8-7-6 with 2 clubs, I would be pure checking my entire range. I bet 165. The low jack elects to call. So I think when he makes the call here, his hands are primarily going to be ace high with a backdoor flush draw, any other flush draw, pairs of 8s, and then a high concentration of pocket pairs. We go to a turn with the pot of 852. The turn is the jack of clubs. It checks to me. At this point, I don't think there's very much merit in me betting. I think I'm really only folding out some pocket pairs without a club that are worse than me, and I think my opponent still has a large continuing range here, and I don't necessarily want to bloat the pot too much when my ace king does have some showdown value. I do elect to check back. The river is the king of clubs, giving me top pair, top kicker, but bringing 4 to a flush on board. The reg checks to me, and I decide to check back here. I don't think there's too much merit in betting here, especially with a third player in the hand that could have a club that scoops most of the pot. I think my top pair is good, but I'm not really gaining any value from worse hands. We show the ace king, and he disgruntlingly chose pocket queens, no club. The older gentleman mucks, so we scoop a pretty large one in this 4-bet pot. In this hand, I open up ace of spades, queen of diamonds from early position to $20. It folds to the hijack, who is a older gentleman. He has been playing on the tighter side. He elects to 3-bet to 60. It folds around to me, and I think I have a mix of possible decisions here. Ace queen off is often a 4-bet bluff here, blocking the top of my opponent's ranges while also not playing particularly well in a bloated pot out of position. I don't think that's the option I would like to use against this particular player type. I think my hand can also mix fold, but I do elect to call here. We go to a flop with a pot of 130. The flop is the ace of clubs, king of diamonds, 2 of spades. I check to the older gentleman and he bets $50 here. I think my hand is a pretty pure call at this point. I don't think raising makes too much sense because I don't expect to get called by worse hands at a high frequency. When the older gentleman bets here, I think a large part of his range is strong ace-X or better. I do think that he bets some lower pocket pairs at a low frequency as well, and then he possibly has some hands like Queen Jack, Jack 10, although I'm not 100% positive that this player is going to be 3-betting too many of those hands pre-flop. I do make the call. We go to the turn with a pot of $230. The turn is the 7 of hearts. The 7 of hearts doesn't really interact with either player's range here. I have some ace 7 suited in this spot, but all of my pocket 7 combos would have been folding the flop. I check to my opponent and he elects to check back surprisingly. I would expect my opponent to be continuing with a large frequency of his pocket aces, pocket kings, ace king style of hand. So I think when he checks back here, I almost always have the best hand. The river is the 5 of diamonds, and I think I have a pretty clear value bet here. Not going to be using massive sizes. I'm trying to get called by worse ace x hands if he decided to bet a king x hand and occasionally pocket pairs, although I do not expect those to be calling at a very large frequency. I do elect to bet around 60% pot, so I bet 150 into 230. He tanks for a little bit and he folds, showing pocket queens, which I was surprised to see. So we got a little bit lucky to spike the ace on the flop here. Overall, this session went well. It was a relatively short session for me. I was only able to play for just over 3 hours, but I bought in for $1,500, cashed out for $2,680. I ended up making a profit of $1,180.